All right, so today we're diving into um, terrorism,
Oh, yeah.
and it's one of those things that I think a lot of people are understandably kind of apprehensive to really like dig deep into,
Mhm.
but it is such a relevant topic. I mean,
Yeah.
especially I think for folks who are listening who are prepping for the UPSC exam,
Absolutely. Yeah.
particularly folks focusing on international relations.
Yeah,
But honestly, this is something that anyone who's just interested in global affairs should really kind of wrap their heads around.
for sure.
So the source material that we're looking at today is an excerpt that really focuses on like defining terrorism, kind of how it's evolved over time, and then different schools of thought around it.
Hmm.
And we're going to be looking at is there really such a thing as new terrorism?
Right.
Can states be perpetrators of terrorism?
Yeah.
And how do different theories explain what motivates these
Yeah,
acts?
some really big questions to unpack.
Yeah.
And they're all interconnected, which makes it so fascinating and complex.
Yeah. So first things first, like how do we even define terrorism? Because it's not as simple as, just like violence or just something like that.
No, it's really not. There's so many layers to it.
Right.
Um, but to give us a framework, our source uses this categorization from Ignatieff, who breaks down terrorism into four main types.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think these are really helpful for just kind of getting a grasp on the different ways that terrorism can manifest.
Yeah. I remember reading about these different types,
Mm.
but sometimes it's hard to keep them all straight in my head. So
Sure.
maybe we can just kind of like refresh our memories on, what those four types are.
Absolutely. So the first type is what Ignatieff calls insurrectionary terrorism. And this is what we often think of when we hear the word revolution.
Okay.
Think of groups that are aiming to overthrow a government entirely.
Right. Like a complete kind of like systematic
Exactly.
uprooting of what
Yeah,
is.
a complete systemic change.
Yeah.
So historical anarchist or communist movements would fall under this category.
Okay. So that's insurrectionary. What's the next one?
Okay, so next we have loner or issue terrorism, and the focus here is much narrower.
Okay.
It's driven by a single cause, often a very specific one.
Okay.
The source mentions the bombing of abortion clinics as an example, or the horrific sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway by Aum Shinrikyo,
Right.
which was a cult with very particular beliefs.
Yeah. It's like a laser focus
Exactly.
on a very specific
Very targeted.
objective.
Exactly.
Okay.
The third type is nationalist terrorism.
Okay.
And these groups are fighting for the independence of a particular group or region.
Okay.
So think of the FLN in Algeria during their struggle for independence from France, or the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka.
Right. So it's about like achieving political autonomy
Yes.
for a specific group, often tied to.
Often tied to a shared identity or a sense of nationhood.
Right. Right. Okay.
And then lastly, we have global terrorism, which has really come to the forefront in recent decades.
Yeah.
This type aims to inflict damage or humiliation on a global power, often with the goal of reshaping the balance of power on an international scale. And of
Mhm.
course, Al-Qaeda is the most prominent example here.
Right. Okay. So
Yeah.
we have those four types: insurrectionary, loner issue, nationalist, and global. And that kind of gives us a framework for understanding like the different goals and scales of terrorism.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Um, and that now the source also gets into this idea of new versus traditional terrorism.
Yes.
And it argues that this idea of new terrorism is marked by kind of a shift from secular motivations to religious motivations.
Mhm.
What do you make of that argument?
Well, it's a popular argument, but I think it's one that we need to approach with a bit of caution.
Okay.
While it's true that the late 20th and early 21st centuries saw a rise in religiously motivated terrorist groups, we can't forget that religious terrorism has been around for centuries.
Right. So it's not a new phenomenon.
Exactly. Not
Brand new.
but it's maybe become more prominent.
Perhaps more prominent or at least more widely discussed.
Right. And it's also worth noting that many of the earlier nationalist groups, for example, were fueled by what we might call secular ideologies like Marxist-Leninism.
Right.
But does that make them inherently less extreme or less dangerous?
Right. It's not about the like what the motivation is. It's about how that motivation is then
Exactly.
manifested, I guess.
It's about the methods and the goals ultimately.
Right.
The source does suggest that religious motivations might lead to more uncompromising goals, a greater willingness to embrace violence as a symbolic act, and even a higher risk of using weapons of mass destruction or WMDs.
Right.
And those are definitely valid concerns.
Yeah.
But if we look back at history, were groups like the Tamil Tigers or the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine both Secular?
Right.
Any less fanatical or brutal in their methods?
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that a clear line can be drawn between new and traditional based solely on religious versus secular motivations.
Right. It seems like there's a lot more nuance there than
I think so.
that kind of like simple binary.
Yes.
The source also points to organizational differences,
Okay.
saying that new terrorists operate in these kind of looser networks like Al-Qaeda, as opposed to the more hierarchical structures of traditional groups.
Right. And again, I think we need to be careful about generalizations here.
Okay.
Groups like the IRA and Fatah, both considered traditional, also utilized decentralized networks. So I think organizational structure is often dictated by context and strategic needs rather than some inherent difference between new and traditional terrorism.
So again, like these neat categories that we try to create,
Right.
they often break down when we look at the
They do.
messiness of the real world.
Exactly. The real world is messy, and these categories are often oversimplifications.
Yeah, okay. So let's shift gears a bit and look at how different schools of thought view terrorism.
Okay.
Let's start with the realist perspective.
All right, so for realists, the key is understanding power dynamics. They see terrorism as a tactic employed by weaker actors who lack the military strength to challenge a state directly.
Okay.
It's a way to try to wear down a stronger opponent to chip away at their power and legitimacy.
So if we were to kind of like play devil's advocate here, would a realist argue that any means of counterterrorism is justified, even if it means compromising civil liberties?
That's a really tricky question, and it brings us to what's often called the dirty hands dilemma.
Okay.
Realists might argue that leaders sometimes have to make difficult, even morally questionable choices to protect the state and its citizens. It's a pragmatic, some might say ruthless approach to security.
Right. And that's where you get that tension between,
Exactly.
the security of the state versus the rights of the individual.
A classic dilemma.
Yeah, for sure. Okay,
Yeah.
so how about the liberal perspective? How do they view terrorism?
Liberals tend to place more emphasis on the role of ideology in fueling terrorism.
Right.
They might argue that distorted perceptions of injustice, often shaped by ideology, are what drive individuals to violence.
And unlike the realists, they would be much more concerned with,
Absolutely.
how do you balance counterterrorism measures with protecting human rights and democratic values?
It's a constant balancing act for liberals.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the realist perspective, we've got the liberal perspective, but I think to get a more complete picture, we really need to look at some of those critical perspectives that kind of challenge those mainstream views.
Right, because those critical perspectives often help us see the blind spots in those mainstream views.
Yeah, and our source highlights two critical perspectives that I think offer some really thought-provoking arguments.
Okay.
The first one is often associated with thinkers like Noam Chomsky and Richard Falk, and they take a very radical stance.
They do?
They argue that state terrorism, which is the use of violence by states against civilians,
Right.
is far more significant than non-state terrorism simply because states have so much more power.
They have a monopoly on violence in many ways.
Right. They point out that states routinely use violence, whether it's to, maintain control within their borders or to exert influence over other states. And some like Chomsky go so far as to label the USA a terrorist state based on its actions abroad.
It's definitely a controversial perspective, but one that forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about power and violence.
Yeah, it really kind of like flips the script on
It does.
how we typically think about terrorism.
Absolutely.
The second critical perspective that we'll explore draws on more like constructivist and post-structuralist ideas.
Okay.
So this is where things get a little bit more theoretical, right?
A bit more theoretical, but bear with me because it's really insightful.
Okay.
Essentially, this perspective argues that the very label of terrorism is a tool that's used to delegitimize certain groups and by implication legitimize the power structures that those groups oppose.
So it's not just about the act itself. It's about how we label it and how that label then shapes
Exactly.
the entire conversation.
It's about how language shapes our understanding of events.
Right? So if we label something as terrorism, it evokes this whole set of emotions and justifies a certain type of response, regardless of what the situation actually is.
Right. It becomes a very powerful rhetorical tool.
Yeah. And this perspective encourages us to think critically about how the war on terror discourse has been used to frame conflicts and justify interventions.
Often with devastating consequences.
Right. It's fascinating and a bit disturbing
It is.
to think about how language can be used to manipulate our understanding of these really complex issues.
Absolutely.
So we've gone from definitions and typologies to the evolution of terrorism and these different theoretical lenses. It's clear that understanding terrorism is anything but simple.
It's a complex, multifaceted
Yeah.
phenomenon.
And before we move on, I think it's important to remind our listeners, especially those who are preparing for the UPSC, that understanding these nuances is crucial.
Absolutely. UPSC examiners aren't looking for you to just regurgitate facts. They understand different perspectives and, critically evaluate different policy responses.
Yeah, like this is real world stuff.
Exactly. This deep dive is really just a starting point.
Right.
It's about giving you the tools to think critically about these issues. Because terrorism is so complex, it's not like there's one simple answer or one solution.
Right.
We've seen how different perspectives can shed light on different aspects of the problem.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so challenging to study,
Absolutely.
but also so fascinating.
It is. It's constantly evolving.
Right, and there's always more to learn.
Always.
So for folks listening out there, especially those prepping for the UPSC, imagine you're facing this tough question in the exam.
Right.
Maybe a case study about a contemporary terrorist incident.
Mm-hmm.
You need to go way beyond just describing what happened.
Right. You need to analyze the motivations, the historical context, the potential consequences for global politics.
It's about connecting the dots.
It's about showing that you can think critically and apply those theoretical frameworks we talked about.
So those frameworks like realist, liberal, critical, those become tools to help you kind of dissect the situation.
Exactly. You could analyze that case study from a realist perspective, focusing on those power struggles we discussed and how different actors are making strategic calculations. Or you could take a liberal approach, looking at the role of ideology and the potential for finding peaceful solutions.
And don't forget, those critical perspectives.
Yes, those are crucial.
They really push you to think outside the box.
They do.
Question assumptions and consider alternative explanations.
And that's what's going to impress those examiners.
Yeah, you got to show them how deep your analysis goes.
Exactly.
But this isn't just about acing the exam.
No, it's bigger than that.
This is like, for anyone out there,
absolutely,
UPSC aspirant or not, who's trying to make sense of the world.
Because terrorism affects us all, directly or indirectly, and being informed is the first step towards understanding how to deal with it.
So true. So this isn't just about, memorizing facts for an exam.
No.
It's about giving you the tools to think critically.
Precisely.
About these issues that affect all of us.
And to make informed decisions as citizens, as voters.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from defining terrorism to exploring its historical evolution and examining it through all these different theoretical lenses.
We have.
But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question to ponder.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with it.
Okay. So we talked about how the term terrorism itself can be a loaded term used to label and delegitimize certain groups. So if we accept that premise, how does that impact our understanding of the phenomenon itself?
That's a great question, and it's one that scholars and policymakers have been grappling with for years.
Well, right, because does it distort our perception of the issue?
Potentially.
Like, are we seeing it clearly if we're starting from that kind of biased label?
It's worth considering.
Yeah, and how does the way we frame terrorism, the language we use, shape our responses?
Exactly.
Both in terms of, government policies and how the public reacts.
It shapes public opinion.
It shapes everything.
It does. It shapes the entire discourse.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So much to think about.
A lot to unpack.
Yeah. It really makes you realize how important it is to be aware of those different narratives and biases that shape our understanding.
For sure.
Of these complex issues.
Awareness is key.
Yeah. And I think that's where resources like the one we've been discussing today come in.
Absolutely.
By taking a deep dive into these different perspectives, we can start to kind of untangle those narratives and form our own informed opinions.
Right. It's about empowering yourself with knowledge.
Exactly. Okay, so for those of you prepping for the UPSC, hopefully this has given you a solid foundation.
I hope so.
For tackling those challenging international relations questions.
Yes.
Remember, the key is to connect this information to current events.
Yes.
And demonstrate your ability to analyze different viewpoints, not just repeat what you've read.
Don't just regurgitate, memorize and regurgitate.
Right. Show them that you can think.
Show them you can think critically.
Yeah, and don't stop with this one source.
No, keep exploring.
Keep reading.
Keep reading. Keep challenging your own assumptions.
Right, because the more you do that, the the better equipped you'll be to not only tackle those exam questions,
Yes.
but also to navigate the complexities of the world around you,
Absolutely.
which is ultimately what we're all trying to do, right?
It's the goal.
Yeah, make sense of this crazy world.
Exactly.
Okay, well, whether you're a future diplomat or just someone who wants to understand global affairs better, we hope this deep dive has been insightful.
It's been a pleasure.
You know, it's like you think you understand something, and then we do one of these deep dives,
Mhm.
and it's like, whoa, okay, there's so much more to it than I initially thought.
It's always a learning experience, right?
Always, always, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me from this whole conversation is how much language matters.
Oh, absolutely.
Like the words we use, the way we frame these issues, it has a huge impact on how we understand things like terrorism.
For sure.
You know, it's like, remember that second critical perspective we talked about?
Yeah.
The one that argues that, you know, the word terrorism is often used to delegitimize certain groups, right?
It's a way of controlling the narrative.
It is. It's like if we just slap that label on something, it's like,
Hope
okay,
it's-
end of conversation. We don't need to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, you shut down any possibility for nuance.
Exactly. And that can lead to, you know, really like bad policies,
Oh, for sure.
you know, that could actually be harmful.
Absolutely knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah, yeah. So for folks listening out there, especially those of you prepping for the UPSC, I think the big takeaway here is don't just accept the labels that you're given.
Yes, question everything.
Question everything. Dig deeper.
Dig deeper.
Ask those critical questions.
Be skeptical.
Be skeptical and try to understand the complexities.
Just complicated.
It is.
No.
There's no easy answers.
Nope. And there are resources out there to help you do that, you know.
For sure.
Books, articles, podcasts like this one.
We try our best.
But yeah, don't be afraid to explore those different perspectives.
Exactly.
And challenge your own thinking.
Challenge your own thinking. That's how we grow.
That's how we grow. That's how we learn. I think that's a great note to end on.
I agree.
So if you enjoyed this deep dive into terrorism, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
Yes, please do.
For more insightful discussions just like this one.
We've got a lot more to come.
We do. We'll be back soon with another episode. So stay tuned. Until then, you know, keep learning.
Keep learning.
Keep exploring and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
It has been fun talking to you, always.
Likewise.
All right. We'll talk to y'all soon. Bye.